Good morning, friends. It's now time to read another chapter. God's grace keeps pace, chapter 14, and there's only 23 chapters, so we're moving right on through it. Chapter 14, How Great is Our God? One of my favorite scriptures right here, Philippians 4:6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Jan fully recovered, and before I knew it, January the 1st arrived once again. Another year, another celebration. Jan turned 6. We counted each birthday a miracle, especially this one after our week in the hospital. Each birthday always brought with it a bit of sadness, further reminding us of the growing difference between Jan and her peers. I couldn't help but think of the child who was and what she'd be doing if the brain damage hadn't occurred. I never allowed myself to give it more than a passing thought, but year after year, those thoughts did surface, along with the thankfulness of being allowed another year with Jan. Without realizing it, we developed our own family practices of dealing with our situation with Jan, just as any family does with any child. At 6, Jan was still Miss Personality, smiling and giggling much of the time. There were certain words or sounds that really got her attention and provoked uncontrollable laughter in her. Whoops. For example, one night, Jan was watching a television series, The Jeffersons. George Jefferson, in the fashion only he could speak, said, Wheezy, he owes me $50. For some reason, Jan loved the way that phrase sounded. She laughed so hard she flipped onto her side, and she still was giggling. So, guess what our family went around saying for the next several years? He owes me $50. S sounds were a whole other story, like sassafras and silly, Sally, and Susan, Susan, Susan. For some reason, she loved words with S's, particularly if the S sound was exaggerated, and we learned to exaggerate S's big time. Each week, we discovered something new that was hysterically funny for Jan. We took full advantage of it. One night, while driving in the car, Mike thought he was about to get pulled over and given a traffic ticket. He said, Sure hope I don't get a ticket. The word ticket cracked her up. So we took full advantage of that word for many years as well, saying, Oh, please don't give me a ticket, ticket, ticket. It was rather hysterical to be around our entertaining family, I'm sure. One day we were in the car and I was drinking a Sonic drink. I moved the straw up and down and to stir the ice, and it made a loud squeaking sound. Jan just giggled in delight. From then on, if we had drinks with straws, we'd have a chorus of squeaking going on as we went down the road. If we only knew, Jan was probably laughing at how ridiculous we all appeared to her as we repeated our silly sounds and phrases and slid our straws in our drinks. I can't wait to find out what she really thought when we get to heaven. We also developed the habit of talking for Jan. One of us would say what we thought Jan would say. One day, when Ben was being a bit rebellious, he said, Mom, it's just so stupid sounding the way you always talk for Jan. Without thinking, he walked over by Jan and stooped down and said in a small voice, Yeah, you guys always say things for me that I never say. I started to laugh, and it took him a second to realize what he had done, and then we both laughed and laughed. Then there was the matter of music. Jan loved music, but she was pretty opinionated about what she liked. If she didn't like it, she started to fuss and would look away from her tape player. She preferred cartoon sounding tapes, similar to the voices on The Fox and the Hound or The Little Mermaid. As Ben became interested in music tapes, one day he proudly brought home Dolly Parton's Working 9 to 5. He played it first on Jan's tape player so she could also listen to it. She looked away from that tape deck and she started to fuss very loudly. He removed his tape. Sorry, Dolly. Still, we weren't without our problems. Lack of sleep continued to be one of our biggest challenges. The area of Jan's brain that allowed her to relax never healed, but her body still needed sleep. Finally, our doctor placed Jan on a nighttime sedative. It helped, but as she grew drowsy, she stiffened her body and fought going to sleep. Her cries were still like an infant, and they were her whole life, only several decibels higher. Since no one could sleep with her screaming, I'd stay up and rock her. This kept her calm until she could fight the sleep no longer. Usually by midnight, I'd put her to bed and fall wearily into bed myself. Bedtime was something I got where I dreaded, and very seldom did Jan sleep through the night. Feeding Jan continued to be another of our big problems, too. Mike was still unable to feed her, but the teachers at school slowly learned how. As Ben observed me feed Jan one day, he said, "Poor Jan, no wonder she eats for you. You just shove it down her. You don't give her a choice." And I think he was probably correct on that. That's why she ate so well for me. I had just learned how to master it and about when to shove it down her. Feeding her was unquestionably tedious, and few people could do it. I think the fact that she choked and coughed so much, attempting to eat was very scary for people. I just was used to it. I learned that certain concoctions of food were easier for her to handle than others. It seemed a banana mashed in each feeding helped her to swallow. So, chicken that was pureed, banana, and a veggie seemed a weird combination, but it worked for her. I'd throw it and totally process it. She'd always choke and spit and sputter as I fed her, but I learned to put a robe over my clothes and a large bib on her. One morning, I had an early appointment. I realized I could make that appointment if I was already dressed and ready to go when Jan's bus picked her up. I got ready, did my hair and my makeup, and then threw on my robe. I fed Jan and rushed her out to the bus as soon as it arrived. I hurried back in, ripped off that robe, grabbed my purse, and as soon as the bus left, and I hopped in the car. Thankfully, I quickly glanced in the rearview mirror at my reflection. I had a table size at least wad sitting right here on top of my head of her food. She'd had a typical coughing spell while I was feeding her, and I knew she spit up some food, but I couldn't find it. Well, I found it when I looked in the rearview mirror. I laughed so hard because I had almost arrived at my meeting wearing that big blob on top of my head, compliments of Jan. That taught me to never leave home without checking in the mirror first. Since Jan's feedings were every 3 hours, when she wasn't in school, she was on a structured feeding schedule. Again, she was like an infant. So when she was hungry, she was fussy and she would begin to do her mouth just like a little bird. If I needed to run errands, I watched the time and was always home in 3 hours. That schedule continued for 13 years. When Jan could no longer live at home, it took me several years to stop checking my watch because that schedule was deeply ingrained in my psyche. The only part of the original program that I continued after stopping the Institute program was Jan's diet and vitamins. I'd increased the quantity, but still gave her 5 to 6 meals a day, each with plenty of protein. Most meals had frozen cubes of pureed chicken, heated in the microwave, then mashed together with other good for you stuff like broccoli, bananas, green beans, and squash. I continued to feed her at least one yogurt a day, and her health remained above average. However, the cerebral palsy, that's the brain damage to the motor controls, increasingly took a toll on her body. She never once in her life was able to feel her face or touch her mouth. And at times, as time went by, her limbs progressively grew tighter and they did this. Her wrists twisted and her thumbs pulled inward. So her hand looked kind of like this. She couldn't wear coats or anything that buttoned down the front because her arms weren't flexible enough to go back behind her. I learned to buy her warm capes or have them crocheted for the winter, and I turned them backwards and buttoned them in the front. I sewed her knit sweatshirts and pants for her daily clothing. I could move her arms like this above her head to pull on a sweatshirt, but I couldn't move them behind her to put on a shirt or a coat. When arms aren't used, they gradually waste away. Some form of physical therapy is the only way to slow that process. I tried to daily stretch her limbs, but sadly, I didn't provide nearly enough movement for her. After we'd stopped the patterning program, I'd taken Jan to physical therapists 3 times a week. When Mike started his own business and we'd changed insurance company, the new policy didn't provide coverage for physical therapy, and I had to stop the therapy. As handicapped as Jan was, it would have cost a small fortune to provide the extensive therapy that she needed. It saddened me to see her condition deteriorate. I'd seen teenagers with CP, and I wondered how their limbs became so taut and drawn. I didn't understand that it was going to happen to Jan too. Now I do. In the summer, swimming was one therapy that Jan could enjoy, and she needed it because she couldn't tolerate heat, though. Summer was normally very long and very difficult, and swimming was about the only thing she could do because the water kept her body temperature down. But we had one problem. Where do you take a 6-year-old to swim who's in diapers? We decided we really needed our own pool. We'd put one in the summer before we moved to Dallas, not knowing we'd be moving. Not only did I not know how to swim very well, still don't, but I was afraid of water. But since one would be so beneficial for Jan and great for Ben, we prayed about it. Amazingly, within a few weeks, the value of some old stock unexpectedly increased to the dollar amount of the pool. We felt we had our answer. We sold that stock, we put in a pool. The pool was a great investment in our family's life. For the first time since Jan was born in the heat of the summer, we all enjoyed something together. Jan dearly loved swimming. I purchased a swim float made especially for handicapped children. It was oblong, foam, and for lack of a better description, it was kind of shaped like a toilet lid because it velcroed in the back and then it came around this way and held her head up. Once we put that on her, it allowed her a freedom to move that she had never experienced. It was the cutest thing. She'd put her toes up on top of in the shallow end, up on top and then back on the bottom, and then she would paddle contentedly from one end of the pool to the other. And that neck float totally kept her head above the water at all times. It was just wonderful. One day, as Mike brought Jan out to swim, holding her on his hip, minus her float, he decided he'd surprise her by jumping directly in from the side instead of walking down the steps of the pool. Jan wasn't the only one that he surprised. Hearing a loud splash, I looked around to see Mike and Jan sitting on the pool floor with only the top of Mike's baseball cap above water. His feet had slipped out from under him, and there they sat, both underwater, Mike with his hat and glasses still on. Before I could come to their aid, Mike stood up, and for a second, we both held our breaths. We were wondering if Jan would be choked. She took a deep breath, and then she squealed and she started to giggle. She thought it was a game. And if she could have spoken, I think she would have said, "Do it again, Daddy." What a blessing that pool was to all of us. God truly does supply all of our needs, even a pool, if it will help a little girl in need of therapy and a boy and his family in need of a fun activity. By now, Ben was almost 11. He was becoming involved in many activities. As Jan became heavier and harder for me to lift, it was wonderful that Mike had his own business. I have always felt that that was a part of God's provision of grace for us too. When Ben had a dental appointment, guitar lesson, or haircut after school, Mike could normally schedule some time to run home and sit with Jan. As the months rolled on, Jan continued to grow, but I didn't. I still remained slightly over 5'2", and her care became more difficult. Many things were just easier to forget than to attempt to do. Vacations became almost impossible. We still tried to go to Mississippi once or twice a year. We packed an ice chest filled with food for Jan and looked for places along the way to warm it. The trip took 14 hours. If we stopped halfway at a motel, Jan didn't sleep and would keep us awake most of the night. It was easier to just drive straight through the 14 hours. The spring was our favorite time to go to the South. It always brought back sweet memories to me of long walks among flowering crabapple trees, dogwood blossoms, black-eyed Susans, and wild violets. I looked so forward to those trips. I was determined to continue to make them. I wanted Ben to experience the farm as well, and Mike was always so gracious to drive us there. That was the only time I got to see my extended family. So early in the spring, we made another one of our Mississippi trips. I held Jan most of the way. She tired after the first few hours, and then she arched her back and pushed backwards. That was her way of letting me know she'd rather be doing something else. 14 hours later, when we finally arrived at my mom's, I had large, and I mean large, clear blisters on the back of my arm. They were from pushing. Jan pushed so much that I rubbed it against the side of the door. My body was exhausted. I had difficulty getting out of the car because I'd been holding her that whole time. The long night still stretched before me. Jan stayed awake till 4 a.m. By daybreak, both Jan and I were sick. I was so disheartened. In fact, I remember we had to call our doctor, mother's doctor, which was a boy I'd gone to high school with, Brian McCraw, and he sent me out a medication. By the time Jan and I recovered, it was time for the 14-hour drive back to Oklahoma. It was a miserable trip. I loved going home, but I knew we couldn't make the trip again in that same fashion. And I prayed, Lord, you know how much it means to me to go home and see my family and spend some time on the farm. Can you work it out where we can still do that? Would you believe before the next trip, we were able to purchase a full-size van with a queen-size bed in the back. It was equipped with a television and a VCR, and both Ben and Jan loved to travel after that. Again, thank you, Lord. It seemed with every obstacle, God provided a solution. More and more, I learned to trust Him with all things. The way wasn't easy, but my burden was light when I turned it over to Him. His grace truly does keep pace with our needs. As the weeks and months sped by, Jan's body continued to grow tighter and tighter. Shortly after her ninth birthday, one day I noticed her holding her left leg up in the air as if it was having a spasm. The leg trembled and Jan cried in agony. The first time it happened, I thought maybe she just had a leg cramp, and that would be the end of it. But it began to happen often. I made an appointment with an orthopedic specialist, took her for an exam. X-rays showed that Jan needed to have surgery. Her hamstrings needed to be released behind the knee and in the groin area. That was a major surgery. It would be life-threatening for Jan, but it had to be done for her comfort. Recovery would be slow, the doctor warned, and he said, that is, if Jan can survive it. So in April, reluctantly, Mike and I checked Jan into Children's Hospital. She'd have surgery at daybreak the next morning. I spent most of the night praying and trying to rock Jan to sleep. I pleaded, Lord, please don't let Jan suffer. I'd rather you take her, Lord, than see her suffer. After the long night, morning finally came. Mike and Ben arrived and we kissed Jan goodbye as she was taken to surgery. With the heart surgeon on standby in case of cardiac arrest, Jan came through the surgery with no complication. You know, we all tend to have expectations, and so I expected her to come to her room very groggy for the next several hours. I was so wrong. She woke up in the recovery room screaming. She had a cast from her waist to her toes, and a wide bar between her legs that held those legs far apart. She was in misery and she was really mad about whatever happened to her when she was asleep. I'm sure she wondered, what have I done to deserve such treatment, my poor little girl? That day was just a nightmare for Jan and for us. Since crying still brought Jan's temperature up, we had to do whatever it took to keep her calm. Finally, with three people working with her, one sponging her face and chest with cool cloth, the second one fanning her, and the third one singing to her, we were able to calm her for short periods of time. The surgeon made his rounds later in the day. He took one look at me and my frazzled nerves, and with a face of compassion, he says, Mom, I know it is awfully hard for you to see Jan crying so much, but you know what? It's actually the best thing she could be doing. After surgery and kids like her, we really worry about pneumonia. Her crying is helping to keep her lungs strong and clear. So that's a good thing. And to think, I felt God had let me down because it seemed He had not answered my prayer, the one about not letting Jan suffer. So much of the time, my sincere prayers were not in her best interest. Would I ever learn that He always knows what's best for us? Jan's crying was literally keeping her alive. You know, we tend to pray out of our own knowledge and wisdom. And sometimes it's just best, I've learned, to say, God, in your mercy, may your will be done, and plead His mercy over whatever the situation is. Because even when I think I'm praying the best thing, it may not be the best thing. Bedtime came that night, and Mike offered to stay the night with Jan and me. But I sent him home with Ben, knowing that it had been an upsetting and difficult day for both of them. After they left, I really thought about the long night that stretched ahead. I'd been awake for almost 36 hours, and most of that was spent on my feet trying to calm Jan. I was beyond exhausted. Y'all probably get tired of me saying that. Lord, please send someone to stay with us tonight. I don't think I can make it by myself. I knew that I needed rest desperately because I was shaky and weak and I could barely stand. Looking at the clock, I realized it was just approaching 10 o'clock. And to myself, I said, who am I kidding? No one is going to come out this late to Children's Hospital. But the phone rang. As I answered, I heard the sweet voice of my neighbor, and that would be Kagar. Pam, I was just thinking about you and Jan. Don't you need someone to stay with you tonight? I was too choked up to speak, but my sobs answered her question. She said, I'll be there as soon as possible. What a godsend Kay was that night. And you know, she had to drive. Children's Hospital is downtown Oklahoma City. She had quite a distance to drive, and her husband was out of town, and she still had a child at home or two. And I think they went to their grandmother's house. So it put her in a really in position, I'm sure. But her giving heart hung up that phone that night and figured a way to meet my need. What a wonderful thing that was. As I hung up the phone, I thought, oh, precious Lord, you are so faithful. Thank you. Thank you. The blessing of that answered prayer gave me energy for the days that followed. After a week in the hospital, we brought Jan home. She was still one miserable little girl. We rented a hospital bed and placed it in our kitchen. We also rented an adult reclining wheelchair. The only time Jan was not fussing was when I was rolling her outside in that wheelchair. And the bumpier the path I took, the more she liked it. And it was noisier and it bounced her around. That's what she liked. What a sight we must have been. Every morning by 9, we were cruising up and down the neighborhood streets. I'm sure the rental chair was practically worn out when we returned it. One of my dear friends, Anita, uh, walked with me every morning. She lived in the neighborhood, And she would walk with me and we would talk and we would laugh. And it was such a blessing to have her walking with me as we rolled Jan around the neighborhood. An inquisitive gentleman who didn't know us but observed us doing those morning marathons said, "Wow, she must have had a doozy of a wreck." We laughed, thinking, "Mister, you don't know the half of it." The cast was supposed to stay on for 6 weeks. After 3 weeks of Jan crying most of the time, I just could barely stand it because I did not know. Did she have bed sores inside the cast? She couldn't tell us what was hurting. I called the doctor's office several times, but they would always say the same thing. Well, we got to wait 6 weeks. Finally, I called with Jan in the room near the phone. They could hear her screaming, and I wanted to make sure they understood what she was doing. And when they heard that, they said, "How quickly can you be at our office?" Believe me, I was there pretty quickly. They took that cast off 3 weeks early. He found the inside of the cast totally saturated with moisture. Jan had perspired profusely each time she cried. It would take several weeks for our lives to get back to normal. Jan recovered in time to go back to school by fall, and I was ready for a break too. I enrolled for my second year of Bible study fellowship. It was another of the Bible studies that my patterners had shared about years before. The discipline and scriptures that I learned there helped prepare me not only for the many difficult days that yet lay ahead, but they laid a foundation for a future ministry that I didn't expect. God's grace keeping pace. I was truly learning I could trust Him in all things. He cared, He saw, He knew, and He was in the work in the midst of it all. I could trust His heart. Let's keep looking for glimpses of His grace, even when our minds don't understand the hows or the whys of what we're going through. And people in this life, uh, Jesus himself, Jesus himself said, "You will have tribulation," and we do. There are very hard things. I know of several people right now going through such hard places that I hurt for them so much. And yet, God's grace is sufficient, and He will. Again, He sees, He knows, He's at work in the middle of it, even when we don't see it. We can trust His heart when we can't trace His hand. There's Jan swimming. Let's see if I can get it where you can see it. That was the most wonderful little float, and it just helped us so much. So whatever you're going through today, take heart. God is there and He sees. Hang in there. Bye.